All right, so we're ready to get concrete poured into this MR-1 base. I just want to remind you, if you haven't watched the video where we went through all of the various checks on this assembly, I urge you to go back and do that. We just want to make sure we check everything, double check things, make sure there's nothing that was assembled incorrectly, make sure that the Y-axis rail and rail mount assembly is positioned properly in the base, that it's level, that our corner drains, if you have them installed, are flowing properly. This is just now the time to make sure that we've done everything correct, because once the concrete starts going in, it's going to be hard to fix any potential errors that may arise. With that said, I'm going to first go over the items that you're going to need. Of course, you're going to need 8 bags of 60-pound concrete. Very important that you get 4,000 PSI concrete, and it can't be quick curing concrete. Want to make sure that we get enough time between when the concrete starts setting up to allow us to finish the concrete, get the base plate installed, the Y-axis rail stiffener. So just regular old Quickcrete 4,000 PSI works really good. I recommend 60-pound bags, makes it easier to handle. And again, you're going to need 8 of those. As far as tools are concerned, I'm going to be mixing this concrete in the most economical way possible. It's a simple concrete mixing tub, and I'm going to be doing it with a hoe. You could also use a shovel. Other tools that we're going to need are just a mixing container. You can get these at basically any home improvement store. It needs to have the volumes delineated on the side so that we can measure out the appropriate amount of water. As far as PPE goes, you're going to need a pair of gloves. Concrete or cement can be irritant to your skin, so very good idea to wear gloves. Similarly, we need a dust mask. So cement is very fine. It can get into the air as dust. We want to make sure that we don't breathe that. We're going to need a steel trowel. So I have 2 here. You really only need 1. You want to use a small trowel because there's a lot of things protruding out of the surface. So we're not going to be troweling big areas. Really a small trowel is good to get kind of into the kind of tight areas on the surface of the concrete. So either one like these is going to work good for us. Before we can trowel the steel, we need to basically smooth out the concrete and get it to the appropriate level. Works really good for that is just a block of wood. This is just an old piece of pallet wood. It's got a rough texture. Works really well for smoothing the concrete out and getting it to the appropriate level. You don't want to use a steel trowel for doing that because a steel trowel will actually close off the surface of the concrete, and that can trap bleed water under the surface, and that will make basically a flaky finish after the concrete's dry. So want to use a piece of wood to smooth it out, and then only trowel it at the very end once the concrete is set up enough for troweling. Other very important tool, we need a rubber-faced hammer or mallet. This is very important. So after the concrete starts going in, we're going to use this to tamp the chip tray and tamp the base plate after that's in so that the concrete can be totally consolidated. We're trying to get all the air bubbles out of the concrete, get all the water to rise up to the surface as bleed water, and that's going to make the strongest, most consolidated, compact concrete possible, which makes the machine base as strong as it can be. We're also going to need some paper towels. These are going to be used for basically after the concrete's all in there, we're just going to use some paper towels, clean up any concrete that may have landed on the rim of the chip tray, the above surface areas of the rail mounts and the stiffeners. If there's concrete on them, we're just going to want to wipe them off. Just do our best to kind of clean up the machine so that it's easier to clean it up before the concrete cures. After the concrete cures, it's harder to remove cement that may be on those painted surfaces. As far as other tools, we're going to need a kind of a hand rag or a small towel. An old shirt works as well. What we're going to be using this for is to basically soak up excess bleed water, and which is kind of a unique strategy for the process of pouring MR1. And that is because we need to mix the concrete to a consistency that provides good workability, which allows us to push the base plate and the Y-axis rail stiffeners into the concrete. And that essentially creates a scenario where you've got some excess bleed water. And normally bleed water will just evaporate because most times you're pouring concrete outside, you've got sun on it, you've got wind going across it, and that helps to speed up evaporation. Here, since we're doing it inside, as most of you at home will be doing, you get much slower evaporation. And we need to soak up that bleed water so that it doesn't affect the strength and the quality of the finish of the concrete. If you don't soak up bleed water, what you can get is basically a flaky surface, and we want to avoid that. So we'll be using that after the concrete's in, and will help us to speed up the process and get it finished up. As far as parts that we need, we're going to need the base plate assembly. So the base plate has the anchors in, and it's got the base plate positioners. Again, I've checked the base plate positioners on the Y-axis rails before I completed this assembly to make sure my spacing of the rails is correct. And you're also going to need the 4 Y-axis rail stiffeners, as well as the button head cap screws and the 5/32 wrench to secure them to the Y-axis rails. With that said, I can go ahead and use my tape to seal up the hole in the corner drains. This is really important because we don't want any cement or concrete or aggregate to fall into these holes and potentially solidify. That would be a bad thing. So we use just some regular old painter's tape to basically seal that hole off and prevent anything from getting in there. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So it's really simple. I'll show you how to do the first one, and then it's the same process for the remaining 3 corners. So I'm going to pull out the mesh filter screen, and we'll set that aside for the duration of this process. I'm just going to use a piece of painter's tape and just basically cover up the hole so that if any concrete inadvertently falls into the corner drain, it won't get down into that hole. I've got my first 60-pound bag of concrete in the tub. The only thing that's left to do is add water, and I can start mixing this concrete. Before you do that, though, make sure you've got enough time to see this process through to the end. You've got about 1 hour between when you start mixing the concrete to when you have all the concrete in the tub or in the chip tray. Otherwise, the concrete will start setting up too much, and it'll make it challenging to push the base plate into the surface of the concrete. So we want to work at a diligent pace through this process. Basically mandatory to have somebody helping you with this. You want to have one person doing the mixing, and then the other person is going to be smoothing the concrete out, pushing it into the areas, tamping the chip tray. So make sure you've got a buddy to help you through this process.
All right, guys, at this point in the assembly process, we wanted to take a little bit of a pause and talk about an important topic, which is water mix ratio in your concrete. Now, getting the perfect mix ratio for your concrete is going to be really important for pouring your concrete base on MR1. You've got problems if you mix it a little bit too soupy. You're going to have problems if you mix it a little bit too dry. Now, the best way that we've come up with to kind of really give you guys the keys to be able to get good consistency is really just to show you. So when you guys mix that first bag of concrete, we recommend just following our recommended mix ratios. That's 5 pints for a 60-pound bag, and that's 6.7 pints of water for an 80-pound bag. So for your first bag, we're just going to start there. Then what we're going to do is use this video as a reference to qualitatively assess our mix, and then either add more water if we need to get better consistency, or on our second bag, we're going to add a little bit of less water if we made it a little bit too soupy with those starting parameters. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the consistency I have here. Off camera, what I did was I just mixed a test batch following our recommended mix ratios, and I just want to show you guys a little bit of what that should look like. So the best way to describe this is really just a thick bowl of oatmeal. You know, it's not too soupy. I can't just push my stick through like it's going through, liquidy mud. It's got a consistency to it. If I hold it up to the light, I can really see kind of the sheen of water and the surface. I know it's got good water content to it. And the other thing too is that it can hold its shape. Now, if I kind of get my glove here and I grab some in my hand, kind of ball it up a little bit and pull away, it should be able to hold its shape like that. If it just kind of falls away or falls through my fingers like a pancake, likely too much water. So then when we do our next bag, we're gonna add a little bit less than that starting point, and we're gonna creep up adding water until we get a good consistency like this. Now, if you have the opposite problem and your mixture is too dry, get your water and add just a little bit at a time. Mix it up again, and then recheck it against this consistency. Keep doing that iteratively until you arrive at a consistency that looks just like this. Now, if you have your mixture too soupy, that presents problems with concrete strength. It'll reduce the strength. It also means there's a little bit too much excess bleed water on top. Now, if we have our mixture too dry, that's workability. Now, when we go and push our base plate and our y-axis rails into the concrete, if it sets up too quickly or we don't have that nice workability to be able to do that, that's going to be a problem. So highly stress that when you guys are mixing your bags, use this video as a reference. Go back and look at it. Make sure you guys are getting this nice consistency. That's really what you want to shoot for. So with that said, go ahead and start mixing your concrete bags. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thanks for watching.
All right, so I've got my 7th bag of concrete mixed and put into the chip tray. And I want to stop at 7, even though I have 8 total bags. I'm stopping at 7. I want to get this smoothed out, kind of leveled out. And then I'm going to move on to putting the y-axis rail stiffeners and the base plate in. Then I'm going to come back, mix that 8th bag, and I'm going to start filling in any low areas with that and try to get it up to the height of the corner drains if I'm not going to be epoxying, or about 1/8 of an inch below the width of the corner drains if I plan on doing the epoxy. I want to make a note to mention here that very important, every time you put a bag in, you're gonna want to push the concrete around and then get your hammer and tamp. Very important to tamp throughout this process, so that we can consolidate that concrete as much as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and use my block of wood here, and I'm going to start pushing this concrete around, get it smoothed out here. And I got the 7th bag in there. The next thing I want to do, and I've got it smoothed out in advance of putting the stiffeners in and the base plate. Very important now, I'm going to walk around the perimeter and I'm going to tamp all the edges. And then I'm going to get on the underside and tamp the underside to get as much consolidation as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. And as you do this, you'll see water start floating up to the top. That's bleed water, and that's exactly what we want to happen. That means we're getting good consolidation. Come on the underside. Okay, a couple more taps. Now I'm ready to go ahead and start putting the y-axis rail stiffeners. So I'm going to grab one here. And I'm just going to secure these on with 2 bolts for now. Once I get all 4 of them on and we get the base plate in, I can come back and put the rest of the bolts in, make sure those line up before the concrete goes in for the 8th bag. Now you should have already done this check fit. So since I've done that, I already know that all the holes are going to line up. So I shouldn't have any issue doing this. Just want to make sure if you have any cement or any residue on here, just wipe it off with your hand before putting this in. So what I'm going to do is basically use a jigsaw motion, a reciprocating motion to push this down into the concrete with the goal of making the top edge line up to the top edge of the y-axis rail. So I'm going to go ahead and start that now. So I've got it basically lined up to the top. Now I'm just making some minor adjustments to get the holes to line up. I'm going to take my button head screws. Go ahead and put one side in. I'm going to come and do the other side. And that's all you got to do. Now I'll come and do the rest of the 3, and then we'll go ahead and put the base plate in. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the base plate into the concrete. Before we do that, what I actually did off camera was I used my trowel, and I just scribed a quick line into the surface of the concrete that's 8 9/16 from the front edge. That's the distance offset the front of the base plate needs to be. And that's going to be just a good visual aid for when I start pushing this in to make sure I've got it relatively close to where it needs to go, fore and aft, and then once it's in, I can make minor adjustments using a tape measure. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this up and get it in position. So I'm just going to roughly line it up to my line here. Pretty good. And then I'm going to line up these tabs and make sure I've got it relatively close to where they're going to drop into these slots to make sure there's no debris or anything in the way that's going to prevent those tabs from resting down onto the surfaces they need to rest on. So that looks pretty good. Now I'm just going to basically use a jigsaw motion and get this pushed in. So it looks like the front's touching, pretty close to touching. I can feel it touching here. Just needs to go down a little farther in the back. Okay, almost there. Okay. All right. So now that I've got it down in there, what I'm going to do is just take a measurement and make any adjustments that I need to get to 8 9/16. So I'm very close. I'm right about 8 1/2. So I'm just going to go ahead and push it forward just a little bit to get it to the final position it needs to be in. We'll go ahead and try it there. Right at 8 9/16. So that's perfect. Okay. The next thing that I got to do now is just go ahead and get my hammer again. And I want to tamp the top of the base plate and then also tamp underneath. So in case there's any air bubbles that are underneath the base plate, I want to get those air bubbles pushed out. So I'm going to pick up my hammer again. I'm going to start tapping here. You really can't use the hammer too much. Very important part of the process. Alrighty, and then the last thing I really need to do is to go ahead and start mixing up my 8th bag. What I'm going to do before that is just continue to try to smooth this out and give me a better idea of where my low spots are. Then I'll get that 8th bag mixed up, and then I'll start picking up the concrete out of the tub and kind of pushing it into the areas that it needs to go. Again, if you're not going to be doing the epoxy, you're going to want to bring the surface of the concrete all the way up to the level of the corner drains. If you're going to be doing the epoxy, shoot for about an 1/8 inch low of the corner drains. And then also, you want to have the surface of the concrete no less than about 1/4 inch below the surface of the base plate. That's so that we have plenty of stock available to face off the base plate without inadvertently cutting into our concrete. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and start moving this around, get it mixed up, and then we'll show you what that looks like. All right, so now I'm just kind of putting the finishing touches on the level of the concrete. I'm, scooping concrete into here where there's low spots. I'm using my block of wood to smooth things out. My main goal here is to really make the concrete as flat as I can and get it to the proper level. And by that, I mean, I want the base plate to be about 1/4 inch higher than the surface of the concrete so that there's, as I said before, we can face it off without hitting the concrete. with the cutting tool. And then the other thing that's really important is around these corner drains, I really want to make sure that I get the concrete as high up to the rim as possible, leaving about 1/8 of an inch if you're doing epoxy, and then bringing it all the way up to the edge if you're not doing epoxy. This tool works really good for that. And as far as doing the corner drain areas, it works really good to use the end of the tool or the piece of wood. So I'm just basically in this area, I know I'm low. I'm just using this to compact the concrete around this drain, bringing it up to the appropriate level. Can fit into these tight areas, which is good. As always, I'm still going around and I'm tamping everywhere, primarily the base plate. That's the most important. And one thing you may notice on yours is that you may have areas where your base plate positioners aren't touching. That's simply because the aluminum plate, it's extruded, it's not perfectly flat, so you could have gaps. The key there is you just want to, if you have only 2 points of contact, in my case, this is touching and this is touching, and I know that this is not touching and this is not touching, I merely want to equalize the gap between those tabs of the base plate positioners and the surface of the base plates. Works really good to use your hammer to basically, you tap opposing corners to, drop that gap, which opens that gap. And all I'm doing is I'm checking the gap here and here and just trying to equalize them. What that'll do is minimize the amount of stock removal we need to correct that out of flat condition. All right, so I'm going to go around and tamp around the perimeter on the underside and on the base plate one last time. Just get every last bit of water out of the concrete and up to the surface if possible. Once I get done with that, then I need to start taking some of this excess bleed water off of the surface in advance of troweling it. So as I had said previously, since we don't have any of this excess water going down into the ground, such as if you're pouring a concrete slab, we really get a lot of excess water up on the top. And then similarly, because the chip tray is above the level of the concrete, the water really has nowhere to go. It can't bleed off the edge, so it just kind of puddles up on the top. And we found that in order to get a nice hard surface of the concrete, we need to remove some of that bleed water. If you don't do that step, what happens is you can get bleed water entrapped under the cream, as they say, the cement upper layer. And that causes the cement upper layer to flake off after it dries. So very important step. I'm just going to go ahead and tamp around here. Just get every last bit of water out of it as I can. All right, then I'm just going to take my towel, and in the areas that are low, you're going to have pulled up water. I'm just going to merely set this on here and just start soaking that water up, that excess bleed water. Then I could pick it up and just wring it out in my bucket. And I'll just keep going around where it's wet and keep doing that. So while I was waiting for the concrete to cure up a little bit more before we could trowel it, I just used some basic old shop towels and a cup of water, and I just went around and cleaned up any concrete residue that was on, for example, the flange, kind of around the uprights on the stiffeners. Just trying to get the machine clean. It's a lot easier to do it when the concrete is still wet, as opposed to kind of waiting a day or two to do that. The other thing I did was I went and put all of the button head cap screws and the stiffeners. You really want to do that just in case if there's one that doesn't line up while the concrete's still wet, you can, shift things slightly until all the bolts line up. We had no issues here. And when the concrete's set up to the point where I couldn't push my thumb in more than about 1/4 of an inch, that's when I got my steel trowel and I started smoothing it out. So I've already troweled it here, but I'll show you kind of just the technique. You just want to use a trowel and you want to lay it onto the concrete and kind of tilt the leading edge up a little bit and just kind of nice smooth motion back and forth. What that does is it'll pull all this water up, and along with it, it'll pull that creamy layer. And that's what allows it to get a nice smooth finish. Now, one thing that you're probably, finding is that there's going to be areas that have exposed aggregate. That's fine. For example, like along this edge, my trowel physically can't fit into there. So I can't trowel that and bring cream up to cover up the aggregate. Not going to be an issue at all. It's not going to affect the performance of the machine. Now I will say, if you are still on the fence about epoxy coating this, I strongly urge you to consider that option. If you're wanting to know what it looks like, we actually have a machine that we just epoxy coated a few days ago. This is what it looked like. Really beautiful thing about the epoxy is that even if you've got low spots, maybe your corner drains, on your concrete, maybe you didn't go up all the way to the level of the corner drains. Beautiful thing about the epoxy is that it floods on there and it self-levels up to the level of the corners. And what that means is that your flood coolant is going to flow really well. It's going to fill in any low spots, so you're not going to have any puddles forming on the surface and kind of losing, flood coolant that way. And then the other thing too is it's just a very hard, durable, non-porous surface. Really easy to clean this off. It's after you get your chips out of there, which MR-1 makes a ton of chips, you're going to be doing a lot of chip clearing. You can just take a rag and clean this off. It works really, really well. And it seals the concrete up, which is a good thing. But back to this here, we don't really have much left to do on this. I just want to congratulate you for getting to this point. At the end of the day, it's really just mixing up concrete, putting it into the bag and, into the chip tray and smoothing it out. It's really all there is to it. Now you're going to want to wait 5 days before you do anything. We want to let this concrete cure at least 5 days. We'll get to 50 to 75% of the max strength by waiting that long. You're going to want to leave your base plate positioners on during that time, and also leave your temporary tray support installed for that entirety of that 5 days. After your 5 day wait's up, you can either, as I said, we recommend going on to doing the epoxy or going straight into final assembly. And with that, thanks again for watching. Reach out if you guys have any questions.